I'm an ICU nurse at Riverside Memorial Hospital in Burlington, Vermont, or at least I was, until I submitted my resignation 4 weeks ago. You can call me Rebecca Chen if you want, though most people in the intensive care unit just called me Becca during my 18 years there. I've seen everything you can imagine in critical care: cardiac arrests, multiple trauma cases, post-surgical complications, drug overdoses, and every kind of medical emergency that brings people to the razor's edge between life and death. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about death itself, and ultimately led me to leave nursing entirely. Riverside Memorial is a 450-bed regional medical center serving central and northern Vermont. It's a comprehensive facility with a state-of-the-art 32-bed intensive care unit that handles some of the most critical cases in New England's rural areas. During my time there, I worked primarily the night shift in our mixed medical surgical ICU, where we treated everything from heart attack patients to trauma victims, post-operative complications, and complex medical emergencies that smaller hospitals couldn't handle. The ICU at Riverside isn't like the massive trauma centers you see on television. We're more intimate, more personal. With only 32 beds, we get to know our patients and their families intimately. We become part of their stories, witnesses to their struggles, and sometimes, unfortunately, the last medical professionals they interact with before crossing over to whatever comes next. Over 18 years of night shifts, I'd been present for hundreds of code blues, held countless hands during final moments, and learned to navigate the delicate emotional territory between medical hope and stark reality. I thought I had seen every possible way a human being could die, every variation of how families cope with loss, and every medical phenomenon that could occur in those final moments of life. I was wrong. The case I'm about to tell you about began on what seemed like a perfectly routine Tuesday evening in October 2023. The autumn leaves were at their peak in Vermont, painting the mountains around Burlington in brilliant reds and golds. It was the kind of crisp fall evening that makes you grateful to live in New England, even when you're about to start a grueling 12-hour night shift. I was beginning my 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, receiving report from the day nurse about our current patients. We had a typical mix: a post-surgical patient recovering from emergency bowel surgery, an elderly man with pneumonia, 2 cardiac patients, a young woman who had overdosed on opioids, and several others. Most were stable or improving. But bed 12 was different. Her name was Zara Okafor, and she was 29 years old. Zara had been admitted just 2 days earlier, after collapsing at the Burlington Farmers Market on Sunday morning. She was a graduate student at the University of Vermont, working on her doctorate in environmental science, and according to her medical history, she was the picture of health. No chronic conditions, no medications, no family history of heart disease. She ran marathons, ate organic, and had never smoked a cigarette in her life. The collapse had been sudden and terrifying. According to witnesses, Zara had been examining organic apples at a vendor's stall when she suddenly clutched her chest, said something's wrong, and fell to the ground unconscious. A retired paramedic, who happened to be shopping immediately, started CPR, while someone called 911. By the time the Burlington Fire Department ambulance arrived, Zara had been without a pulse for approximately 8 minutes. The paramedics managed to get her heart beating again, using defibrillation and medications, but 8 minutes without oxygen to the brain is significant, potentially catastrophic. They rushed her to Riverside Memorial, where our emergency department team was already waiting. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, our chief cardiologist, immediately took Zara to the cardiac catheterization lab to investigate what could have caused such a massive heart attack in an otherwise healthy 29-year-old woman. What Dr. Hendricks found defied medical explanation. Zara's coronary arteries were completely normal, no blockages, no narrowing, no signs of disease. Her heart muscle showed evidence of damage from the arrest, but there was no identifiable cause for why her heart had suddenly stopped beating. Blood tests ruled out drug overdose, genetic conditions, and electrolyte imbalances. It was as if Zara's heart had simply decided to stop working for no medical reason whatsoever. Dr. Hendricks consulted with specialists at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center and even reached out to colleagues at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. No one could explain why a perfectly healthy young woman would suffer sudden cardiac death with no underlying cause. When I took over Zara's care that Tuesday evening, she had been unconscious for 2 days. She was on a ventilator, requiring minimal medications to support her blood pressure, a good sign that her heart function was recovering, but her neurological status remained concerning. The prolonged period without oxygen had likely caused significant brain damage, though the full extent wouldn't be known until she either woke up or didn't. What made Zara's case particularly heartbreaking was her family situation. She was an only child, and her parents, Dr. Emeka Okafor and Dr. Adana Okafor, were both physicians who had immigrated from Nigeria in the 1980s. Dr. Emeka was a respected internist in Boston, and Dr. Adana was a pediatric surgeon at Children's Hospital. They understood the medical realities of their daughter's condition better than most families, which made their vigil even more painful to witness. The Okafors had driven up from Boston immediately when they received the call about Zara's collapse. They had been maintaining a constant presence at her bedside, taking turns so that one of them was always with her. As fellow medical professionals, they asked informed questions about her care, understood the significance of her test results, and were painfully aware of what 8 minutes without oxygen could mean for their daughter's brain function. But despite their medical knowledge, or perhaps because of it, they refused to give up hope. Dr. Emeka would sit beside Zara's bed reading aloud from her research papers and dissertation drafts. Dr. Adana played recordings of Zara's favorite Afrobeat music and classical pieces she had loved since childhood. They talked to her constantly, sharing updates about her research advisor, who had called daily, her boyfriend Marcus, who was flying back from a conference in Europe, and news from the environmental science department, where she was highly regarded. "She's always been a fighter," Dr. Adana told me during one of my routine assessments. "When she was little, she had pneumonia, and the doctors said she was too sick, too weak. But she proved them wrong. She's proving them wrong now too." I had seen this hope before in countless families, and I understood both its power and its potential for causing additional pain. As a nurse, part of my job was to be honest about medical realities, while still supporting families through their grief and hope. "Dr. Okafor," I said gently, "I understand your hope, and I've seen Zara's strength in how well her body is recovering from the cardiac arrest. But you know as well as I do that the brain injury from oxygen deprivation can be significant." "I know, Dr. Adana replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But look at her vital signs when we talk to her. Her heart rate changes when we mention Marcus. Her blood pressure responds when we play her favorite music. She's listening, Rebecca, I know she's listening." Dr. Emeka was right about Zara's physiological responses. During my assessments over those first 2 days, I had noticed subtle changes in her vital signs that seemed to correlate with certain stimuli. When her parents played Fela Kuti's music, her heart rate would increase slightly. When they talked about her research on climate change impacts in West Africa, her blood pressure would fluctuate. When Marcus called and her mother held the phone near her ear so he could talk to her, her respiratory rate would change. These responses were interesting, but they weren't necessarily meaningful from a neurological standpoint. Unconscious patients often show autonomic responses to familiar voices, music, or emotional stimuli. The brainstem, which controls basic life functions, can remain active even when higher brain functions responsible for consciousness are severely damaged. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, our neurologist, had performed multiple assessments and EEGs on Zara. The results were mixed and difficult to interpret. Her brain showed electrical activity, but not the organized patterns associated with consciousness or awareness. There were no responses to painful stimuli, no purposeful movements, and no signs that she could hear or understand what was happening around her. It's too early to make definitive statements about her prognosis, Dr. Walsh explained to the family. Brain injuries from oxygen deprivation can be unpredictable. Some patients make remarkable recoveries, while others never regain consciousness. We need to give her time and continue supportive care. But privately, Dr. Walsh was less optimistic. She had confided in me that 8 minutes without oxygen, especially in the brain of a young adult, where oxygen demands are high, typically resulted in significant and permanent damage. The subtle vital sign changes the family had noticed were most likely autonomic reflexes rather than conscious responses. As Zara's primary night nurse, I found myself caught between medical realism and the desperate hope of her family. The Okafors were intelligent, educated people who understood the science, but they were also parents watching their only child fight for her life. I had to balance being honest about the medical facts while still supporting them through this nightmare. One detail that made Zara's case particularly poignant was the nature of her doctoral research. She was studying the impact of climate change on traditional agricultural practices in West Africa, specifically how changing rainfall patterns were affecting food security in rural Nigerian communities. Her research combined environmental science with social justice, examining how climate change disproportionately affected the world's most vulnerable populations. Dr. Emeka would often read excerpts from Zara's work aloud to her, his voice filled with pride even in the midst of his grief. "Listen to this paragraph she wrote about sustainable farming techniques," he would say, as if Zara might wake up to discuss her research findings. "She's going to change the world with this work, Rebecca. She's going to help so many people." Zara's research advisor, Dr. Michael Torres, called every day for updates and had even driven up from UVM to visit. He described Zara as one of the most brilliant and passionate students he had ever worked with, someone who combined rigorous scientific methodology with genuine compassion for the communities she studied. She was supposed to defend her dissertation this spring, Dr. Torres told me during one of his visits. She'd already been accepted for a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford. She had her whole career mapped out: research, teaching, making a real difference in the world. These conversations about Zara's future, about the life she had been building, and the impact she was meant to have, made her current condition even more tragic. Here was a young woman who had dedicated herself to helping others, who had so much to offer the world, lying unconscious with an uncertain future because of a medical event that no one could explain. By Tuesday evening, Zara's care had settled into a routine. Her heart function was nearly back to normal, which was encouraging. Her other organs, kidneys, liver, lungs, were functioning well. The only remaining question was her brain, and that question could only be answered with time. I performed my usual assessments every 4 hours, checking her pupils' response to light minimal, testing her reflexes, some present, some absent, monitoring her vital signs, stable, and ensuring her ventilator was functioning properly. Her parents maintained their vigil, one always present, talking to her, playing music, holding her hand. Marcus had arrived from Europe on Monday and had barely left her bedside since. He was a doctoral student in renewable energy engineering at MIT, and according to her parents, he and Zara had been planning to get engaged after she finished her dissertation. Watching him sit beside her bed, holding her hand, and telling her about the sustainable energy conference he'd been attending when she collapsed, was heartbreaking. "I brought you something from Copenhagen," Marcus would whisper to her, "a book about wind energy innovations in Denmark. I thought you'd want to read about how they're integrating environmental science with engineering solutions. When you wake up, we'll plan that trip to Denmark you've been talking about. These conversations, filled with future plans and shared dreams, continued around the clock. The family created a schedule so that Zara was never alone, always surrounded by familiar voices and the music she loved. On Tuesday evening, I began to notice some changes in Zara's condition that concerned me. Her heart rhythm, which had been stable since her admission, started showing occasional irregular beats. Nothing dramatic, just premature ventricular contractions that would appear on the monitor every few minutes. Her blood pressure, while still within normal ranges, was requiring slightly more medication to maintain. These changes weren't necessarily alarming in isolation, but they represented a shift from the steady improvement she had been showing. I documented the changes carefully and called Dr. Hendricks to report my observations. Her potassium and magnesium levels came back slightly low this afternoon. Dr. Hendricks told me over the phone, "I've ordered replacement therapy. The irregular heartbeats are probably related to the electrolyte imbalances. Keep a close eye on her rhythm overnight and call me immediately if you see any sustained arrhythmias." I adjusted Zara's IV medications, adding potassium and magnesium supplements, and increased the frequency of her cardiac monitoring. The irregular beats continued sporadically throughout the evening, but they weren't frequent enough or dangerous enough to require immediate intervention. Dr. Rebecca was at her bedside during the early part of my shift, and he noticed the changes in her heart rhythm immediately. As an internist, he understood the significance of what he was seeing on the monitor. "Rebecca, her heart rhythm is different tonight," he observed. "Should we be concerned about these irregular beats?" I explained about the electrolyte imbalances and the corrective measures we were taking. "It's not uncommon for patients recovering from cardiac arrest to have some rhythm irregularities as their heart muscle heals," I assured him. "Dr. Hendricks is aware, and we're monitoring her closely." But I could see the worry in his eyes. After 2 days of steady improvement, any change in Zara's condition felt ominous to her family. Dr. Rebecca squeezed his daughter's hand and whispered, "Stay strong, my dear. We're all here with you." At around 11 p.m., Dr. Andan arrived to take over the vigil from her husband. She brought with her a new playlist of music, a mix of Nigerian folk songs, classical pieces, and some contemporary artists that Zara enjoyed. As she settled into the chair beside Zara's bed, I noticed that the irregular heartbeats on the monitor seemed to be becoming more frequent. I checked Zara's latest lab results on the computer. Her potassium and magnesium levels were improving with the replacement therapy, but not as quickly as I had hoped. The irregular beats were likely still related to these imbalances, but I decided to call Dr. Hendricks again to get her assessment. "The PVCs are increasing in frequency," I reported. "Maybe one every minute or two now, instead of every few minutes. Her blood pressure is stable, and she's not showing any other signs of distress. Continue the electrolyte replacement, and I want you to have a crash cart immediately available in her room," Dr. Hendricks instructed. "If she goes into a sustained dangerous rhythm, we'll need to cardiovert her immediately. Her heart muscle is still healing from the original arrest, so any prolonged arrhythmia could be problematic." I moved a crash cart into Zara's room and positioned it discreetly where her mother wouldn't immediately notice it. Dr. Adana was absorbed in reading aloud from one of Zara's research papers, her voice soft and soothing as she shared her daughter's work on sustainable water management in drought-prone regions. Marcus arrived around midnight with coffee for Dr. Adana and settled into the second chair beside Zara's bed. The two of them created a peaceful atmosphere in the room, taking turns reading, playing music softly, and maintaining a steady stream of gentle conversation directed toward Zara. "Your advisor called again today," Marcus told her, stroking her hand. "He said the conference presentation you were supposed to give next month has been postponed until you can deliver it yourself. Everyone in the department is waiting for you to come back and teach them about your latest findings." At 2:33 a.m. on Wednesday, October 25, 2023, everything I thought I knew about death and consciousness changed forever. I was at the nurse's station, charting Zara's midnight assessments, when her cardiac monitor alarm suddenly stopped its intermittent beeping and began emitting the steady, continuous tone that every medical professional knows and dreads. I looked up at her monitor display and felt my blood turn cold. Zara was in ventricular fibrillation, a chaotic, ineffective heart rhythm that meant her heart was essentially quivering instead of pumping blood. It was the same lethal rhythm that had likely caused her initial collapse at the farmer's market. I ran to her room, confirmed that she had no pulse, and immediately hit the code blue button while starting chest compressions. Dr. Adana, despite being a surgeon herself, stepped back to let me work, her face pale with terror as she watched me begin CPR on her daughter. "What's happening?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with panic. "Her heart rhythm is unstable," I explained while continuing compressions. "The code team is on their way." Within 2 minutes, our code team had assembled in Zara's room. Dr. Hendricks, Dr. Walsh, 2 other nurses, our respiratory therapist Jake Martinez, and Dr. Kim Santos, our night resident. We worked with the practiced efficiency that comes from years of experience with cardiac arrests, but there was an added urgency, because this wasn't a stranger. This was a patient we had all been caring for, hoping for, fighting for, over the past 2 days. "How long has she been down, Dr. Hendricks asked as she took over compressions from me. "Less than 3 minutes from the time I saw the rhythm change," I reported while preparing medications. We followed advanced cardiac life support protocols exactly: chest compressions, ventilation, epinephrine, amiodarone, defibrillation attempts. But Zara's heart wasn't responding to any of our interventions. The ventricular fibrillation had deteriorated into ventricular tachycardia, then finally into the flat line of asystole, no electrical activity at all. Dr. Adana stood in the corner of the room, tears streaming down her face, watching as we tried desperately to restart her daughter's heart. Marcus held her shoulders, both of them understanding enough about medicine to know that with each passing minute without a pulse, the chances of meaningful recovery diminished exponentially. "Let's try transcutaneous pacing," Dr. Hendricks ordered after 20 minutes of unsuccessful resuscitation. I attached the external pacing electrodes to Zara's chest. The machine began delivering electrical impulses directly to her heart muscle, and we could see the pacing spikes on the monitor, but there were no actual heartbeats following the electrical stimulation. Her damaged heart simply wasn't responding. At 3:18 a.m., after 45 minutes of aggressive resuscitation, Dr. Hendricks made the decision that every physician dreads. "I'm calling it," she said quietly, her voice heavy with defeat. "Time of death, 3:18 a.m. The room fell silent, except for the mechanical sound of the ventilator, which would soon be turned off. Dr. Adana collapsed into Marcus's arms, and the sound of her grief filled the room. I began the terrible process of preparing to notify the family about next steps and documenting the failed resuscitation attempt. But as I reached over to turn off the cardiac monitor, something impossible happened. Zara opened her eyes, turned her head to look directly at her mother, and in a clear, strong voice said, "Mama, please don't cry. I'm okay. I need to tell you something important." The monitor still showed the flat line of asystole. Zara had no heartbeat, no blood pressure, no pulse. But she was conscious, alert, and speaking with perfect clarity. Everyone in the room froze. Dr. Hendricks stared at Zara with an expression of complete bewilderment. The nurses, the respiratory therapist, Dr. Walsh, all of us stood motionless, as if any movement might shatter whatever impossible phenomenon we were witnessing. "Zara," Dr. Adana whispered, moving toward the bed. "My baby, can you hear me?" "Yes, Mama," Zara replied, her voice surprisingly strong despite having been on a ventilator for days. "I can hear everything. I've been listening to you read my research. I heard Marcus telling me about Denmark. I heard Papa playing Fela Kuti yesterday. I checked the monitor again, looked for any sign of electrical activity, any indication that we had missed something in our assessment. The screen showed only the flat line of cysto. I pressed my fingers to Zara's wrist, then to her neck, searching for any pulse. Nothing. Her skin was already beginning to feel cool, the way it does when circulation stops. But Zara was not only conscious, she was more alert and articulate than many patients I had seen, who were perfectly healthy. "This is impossible, doctor," Hendricks murmured, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. "I know it doesn't make sense medically," Zara said, having heard Dr. Hendricks' comment, "but I'm here, and I need to use whatever time I have left." What followed was the most extraordinary and haunting conversation of my nursing career. For the next 22 minutes, Zara spoke with complete cognitive clarity while her heart remained completely stopped. She shared knowledge she couldn't possibly have acquired while unconscious, gave detailed instructions about her research, and delivered messages that would forever change how I understood the boundary between life and death. "Marcus," Zara said, turning her gaze to her boyfriend, "in my laptop, there's a folder called Copenhagen Dreams. I started writing our wedding vows there. I know we never officially got engaged, but I was planning to propose to you when I finished my dissertation." Marcus's face crumpled with grief and shock. "Zara, how did we never talked about? I heard you whispering to me yesterday about the ring you bought in Boston," she said softly. "The one you've been carrying around for 2 months, waiting for the right moment. The right moment is now, Marcus. I need you to know that yes." My answer would have been yes. Dr. Hendricks frantically checked for vital signs again, confirmed the monitor readings, and even ordered another EKG machine to be brought in. Every test confirmed the same impossible reality. Zara had no cardiac activity, no blood pressure, no detectable pulse, but was nevertheless fully conscious and communicating with perfect clarity. "Dr. Hendricks," Zara said, acknowledging the cardiologist's confusion, "I know this doesn't make medical sense. I can see myself from above sometimes. I know you've been trying so hard to save me, but my research needs to continue. In my desk at UVM, there's a flash drive with data from my last field study in Nigeria. Dr. Torres doesn't know about it yet. The communities I worked with, they're going to face severe water shortages in the next 3 years unless someone acts on my findings." She turned back to her mother. "Mama, you and Papa need to contact Professor Adebayo at the University of Lagos. His email is in my phone under Nigeria contacts. He can implement the water conservation methods I developed. The data shows exactly which villages need help first." Dr. Adana was sobbing and holding her daughter's hand. "Zara, my baby, we'll take care of everything. But please, how is this happening? How are you talking to us? I don't understand it either, Mama," Zara replied, "but I've been conscious this whole time. I heard every conversation, felt every touch, absorbed every prayer. When you played Fela Kuti, I could feel the music in my soul even though my body couldn't respond. I heard Papa crying when he thought no one could hear him. I felt Marcus's tears on my hand when he told me about the conference." Throughout this conversation, Zara demonstrated knowledge of events that had occurred while she was unconscious, details that no one had spoken aloud in her presence. She mentioned a phone call Dr. Torres had made to her parents the previous afternoon while they were in the hospital cafeteria. She knew about a conversation between Marcus and her father about her dissertation timeline that had taken place in the hallway outside her room. She even referenced a text message her mother had received from a colleague that morning about a surgical case. "Dr. Chen," Zara said, using my formal name, although everyone called me Becca, "thank you for being so patient with my family. I heard you explaining my condition to them with such kindness. You told them it was okay to hope even when the medical facts were discouraging. That meant everything to us." I felt chills run down my spine. Zara was referring to private conversations I'd had with her parents over the past 2 days, moments when I thought she was completely unconscious. "But there's something else," Zara continued. "Yesterday, when you were alone with me during the night shift, you told me about your own daughter, about how you understand what my parents are going through because you almost lost your daughter in a car accident 3 years ago. My hand started trembling. That conversation had happened during a quiet moment at 3 a.m. when I was checking Zara's ventilator settings. I had spoken to her the way I sometimes talk to unconscious patients, sharing a personal story about my own experience with nearly losing a child. No one else had been present, and I had never mentioned that incident to any of her family members. You said that you learned to appreciate every ordinary moment with your daughter after that accident, Zara continued. You told me that even unconscious patients sometimes need to hear that they're not alone in their fight. You were right, Dr. Chen. I wasn't alone. As our entire medical team stood witnessing this impossible phenomenon, Zara continued sharing specific instructions and messages. She asked her mother to donate her research equipment to graduate students who couldn't afford their own field instruments. She wanted her father to contact her research participants in Nigeria to explain that the project would continue through Professor Adebayo. Marcus, my laptop password is climate. Justice 2024, she said. In my email drafts there's a letter I wrote to the Stanford Fellowship Committee. I was going to decline their offer because I wanted to spend another year in Nigeria collecting more data. But the work is important enough that someone else should take that opportunity. Dr. Torres will know who should apply. She paused, her breathing becoming slightly more labored, though the monitor still showed no heartbeat. There's something else. In my apartment, in the bottom drawer of my desk, there's a journal I've been keeping since I started my research. It's not just scientific observations, it's about the people I met, their stories, their hopes for their children's futures. Someday, I want someone to write a book about them. Their voices deserve to be heard. Dr. Walsh, our neurologist, had been silently observing throughout this entire conversation. Finally, she spoke up. Zara, from a medical standpoint, what you're doing right now is impossible. Can you help us understand what you're experiencing? Dr. Walsh, I wish I could explain it, Zara replied. It's like I'm in two places at once. I can see my body lying here, and I understand that my heart has stopped. But my consciousness, my awareness, it feels separate from my physical body. I'm not in pain. I'm not struggling to breathe. I just am. At 3:35 a.m., nearly 20 minutes after we had declared her dead, Zara's speech began to slow slightly. I can feel myself starting to fade, she said, her voice becoming softer but still clear. The connection between my consciousness and my voice is getting weaker. She looked at each person in the room. Dr. Hendricks, please don't blame yourself for not being able to save me. You gave me extra time with my family, and that was a gift. Dr. Walsh, continue researching consciousness. There's so much more to understand about the human mind than we currently know. Turning to Marcus, she said, take care of my parents. They're going to need you. And Marcus, find someone who makes you as happy as you made me. Don't spend your life mourning what we didn't get to have. Celebrate what we did have. To her mother she whispered, Mama, teach Sophia's children about their Nigerian heritage the way you taught me. Keep the traditions alive, and tell Professor Adebayo that the girl who used to ask too many questions about everything finally found some answers. Finally, she looked at me. Dr. Chen, trust your instincts about patients. Sometimes consciousness exists in places where medical tests can't detect it. Keep talking to your unconscious patients. They might be listening more than you know. At 3:40 a.m., 22 minutes after her initial cardiac arrest, Zara closed her eyes for the last time. I love you all, she whispered. Take care of each other, and take care of my research. The work matters more than any of us individually. Her voice faded, and for the first time since she had started speaking, she was quiet. We waited, hoping that whatever phenomenon had allowed her to communicate might also restore her vital signs. But the monitor continued showing the flat line of a systole, At 4:02 a.m., Dr. Hendricks officially pronounced Sarah Okafor dead for the second time. This time the pronouncement was final. The rest of that shift remains a blur in my memory. We completed the necessary documentation, prepared Sarah's body, and began the difficult process of supporting her family through their immediate grief. But how do you document in a medical record that a patient spoke coherently for 22 minutes while clinically dead? How do you explain to medical authorities that an entire code team witnessed something that defies every principle of modern medicine? Dr. Hendricks and I made the decision to document that Sarah had experienced a brief return of consciousness before her final cardiac arrest, a phenomenon that, while unusual, was at least medically possible. We shared with her family the specific messages she had asked us to convey, but we simplified the timeline of events to make them more believable. The family was grateful for the opportunity to hear Sarah's final words, and they immediately began following through on her instructions. Dr. Torres was contacted about the hidden research data. Professor Adebayo in Nigeria was reached and agreed to continue Sarah's work. Marcus, despite his grief, began the process of ensuring Sarah's research would have the impact she had envisioned. But I couldn't shake the profound implications of what I had witnessed. If Sarah had been conscious during her days in the ICU, aware of every conversation and every medical decision being made about her care, what did that mean for every other unconscious patient I had cared for over 18 years? In the weeks following Sarah's death, I found myself unable to function effectively as an ICU nurse. During every assessment of unconscious patients, I wondered, are they listening? Do they understand what I'm saying about their prognosis? Are they aware that their families are making end-of-life decisions based on my medical assessments? 3 weeks after Sarah's impossible conversation, I was caring for an elderly man in a similar condition, cardiac arrest with possible brain injury. As I was explaining to his family that his prognosis was poor, I noticed what appeared to be a single tear rolling down his cheek. His daughter insisted that he always cried when they discussed difficult topics, but I had attributed this to autonomic reflexes. After Zara's case, I found myself wondering, what if I was wrong? What if he was listening to every word I said about his hopeless condition? I completed that shift, but I knew I couldn't continue practicing nursing with the level of uncertainty that Sarah's case had created. How could I authoritatively tell families that their loved ones were unconscious when I had witnessed the impossible once before? I submitted my resignation from Riverside Memorial Hospital the following Monday. In my resignation letter, I cited personal reasons and a desire to pursue other opportunities. But the truth was that Sarah Okafor's impossible 22 minutes of consciousness had fundamentally shaken my understanding of life, death, and everything I thought I knew about human awareness. I moved to a small town in rural Vermont, and now work in a family practice clinic, handling routine medical care like diabetes management, blood pressure monitoring, and preventive care, conditions with clear diagnostic criteria and established treatment protocols. I deliberately avoid any cases involving critical care, unconscious patients, or questions about the boundary between life and death. But I never stopped thinking about Sarah. I followed up on her research through news articles and academic publication. Professor Adebayo successfully implemented her water conservation methods in Nigerian villages, and the communities she studied now have sustainable water sources that will last for decades. The Stanford Fellowship was awarded to another graduate student who continued her work on climate justice in West Africa. Marcus, despite his grief, completed his engineering doctorate and now works on renewable energy projects in developing countries, a path that honors both his own expertise and Sarah's commitment to environmental justice. Sarah's case remains unexplained from any medical or scientific standpoint. I've researched consciousness studies, near-death experiences, and every piece of literature I can find about awareness during cardiac arrest. While there are documented cases of patients reporting awareness during resuscitation, I found nothing comparable to what we witnessed: sustained coherent conversation while clinically dead. The most important lesson from Zara's impossible conversation may not be medical but profoundly human. It reminded me that consciousness might persist in ways our current understanding cannot detect or measure. It suggested that the people we label as unconscious may be far more present and aware than we realize. For me, Zara's 22 minutes of impossible consciousness will always represent the mystery at the heart of human existence, the questions about awareness, consciousness, and what it truly means to be alive that our medical knowledge cannot yet answer. Her case taught me humility about the limits of scientific understanding, and forever changed how I approach the sacred boundary between life and death. The case of Zara Okafor will always remain the most unexplained and humbling experience of my nursing career. It reminded me that medicine, for all its advances, still contains profound mysteries that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about consciousness, death, and what it means to be truly alive.